Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Emma.
3 years ago, Kabul fell and the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan after the US and its allies withdrew their troops from the country.
Taliban fighters have broken through the front line.
The Taliban has claimed victory in a 2-decade conflict.
This seems to be a complete takeover now, does it not?
Since that time, the Taliban has introduced a whole host of new laws to try and, regulate how they would like the Afghan community to work, to function, to learn. And so what we have seen is that the lives of Afghan citizens and disproportionately the lives of Afghan women have over time become more and more restricted. That's included things like banning women from high schools, universities, and most forms of employment. Now, the latest restrictions include a ban on women's faces and voices in public, and that is what we are talking about today.
Yeah, and that's really been the big headline this week. Women's faces and voices banned in public under this new Taliban ruling. But I think to really understand the headline and what that means, we need to understand a lot more about the context of Afghanistan, the country, and the Taliban as a group themselves. So Zara, can you start by telling us a bit about the Taliban and how they came to power?
Yeah, it's a good question and you're right. That does explain or go part of the way in explaining where we find ourselves today. So the Taliban, which roughly translates to students in English, is an Islamist militant group in Afghanistan. Now, the group is by no means new, except that we are hearing about them more and more often now, and I'll get to why that is soon. But the group actually has origins dating back to the 1970s in northern Pakistan. They properly emerged in the early 1990s after the group consolidated power and began seizing territory in a civil war. The Taliban then took power and began governing in Afghanistan in 1996. Now, under the Taliban's rule at that time, women were oppressed under strict regulations that it said are firmly rooted in Islamic teachings. There were public displays of punishment and ancient sites were destroyed. At that time, and remember we're talking about a rule that started in 1996, the majority of the world did not recognise the Taliban as a legitimate government. Then everything changed after 9/11. The US accused the Taliban of hiding and protecting al-Qaeda, which was the group who claimed responsibility for the attack. And then in October 2001, the US and its allies invaded Afghanistan. Again, because of what I just said. They said that the Taliban was helping al-Qaeda. At that point, the Taliban was defeated and was forced to flee Kabul on December 6th, 2001. What happened from 2001 to 2021 is an extremely long period and, would require a podcast of its own. But I think it's fair to say it was a tragic 20-year war. It's often referenced as the Forever War because of just how long it went on. But then in 2021, as I mentioned, US President Joe Biden announced that finally US troops were going to be withdrawn from Afghanistan. It was hoped, and at least the Biden administration made clear that their intention was that the Afghan government and the security forces there locally would be able to defend themselves and that peace talks initiated with the Taliban would find a long-term solution. That is, of course, not what happened. And once the US and its allies withdrew, the Taliban almost immediately seized power. And that is when we started hearing that Kabul had fallen.
Okay, so we had 20 years of a US-bolstered Afghan government, and then when US and allied troops left the region, that government fell to the Taliban. So,
it just created a sort of vacuum that the Taliban then took a huge opportunity to just fill themselves.
And I don't think that many leaders in the West expected it to happen as quickly as it did, but we're talking about a matter of days.
Yeah.
So that's 2021. What has happened ever since?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the concerns that the international community held about what a Taliban rule might look like, we had seen it happen in 1996 and nothing had really changed. The Taliban of today very much resembled the Taliban of back then, and those fears about what Taliban rule would mean for Afghan people, but specifically what it would mean for women, those fears have been realised. So senior UN officials describe Afghanistan under Taliban rule as the, quote, most repressive country in the world for women's rights. I typed in Taliban to our website to just, give myself a run through of what we've written over the past couple of years. And the top 2 results were, and I'm quoting here, the Taliban has banned women from working for humanitarian organizations in Afghanistan, and the Taliban has suspended women from universities in Afghanistan. And so that gives you a sense of what sort of stories we have seen coming out of Afghanistan over the past few years. And does paint a picture as to the fact that Afghan women's access to education in particular has been remarkably limited just in that 3-year time.
Yeah, and we're talking about women and girls. We're talking about girls'
Absolutely.
education too, because we saw a shift to restricting high school education access. So girls could go to primary school, but they are no longer educated past that level. And then the generational kind of gaps and inequalities that come out of that will remain to be seen for generations to come.
Exactly. And I mean, it's difficult to assess what has happened in such a short period of time and what the kind of long-term impacts of that look like. But UN Women has done a bit of that analysis, I'd say preliminary analysis, and they found that by 2026, the impact of leaving 1.1 million girls out of school and over 100,000 women out of university is correlated with an increase in the rate of early childbearing by 45% and an increased risk of maternal mortality by at least 50%. So those are just some of the stats that the UN is really looking at as what have we seen happen so far over the last 3 years and what could that mean for civil society moving forward?
And when we say that increased risk of maternal mortality, that's referring to deaths during childbirth.
Correct.
So that gives us a picture of the last 3 years of Taliban rule in Afghanistan and the restrictions on the lives of women in particular. So let's get back to the big news this week, that headline around women's voices and faces being banned in public. What do we know about this tranche of restrictions?
Before I answer that, I do think that it's important that now we've set out that timeline. I think it's important to know that so many people watching Afghanistan are not surprised by this latest news, that it does come in a string of events that we have slowly seen women's rights eroded in the most explicit ways, but that this didn't happen out of nowhere. It has slowly been happening for the past 3 years. And as you said, this is now just the latest tranche of laws. So last week, we learnt that the Taliban's Ministry of Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice announced several new laws.
So that body is, they manage the morality police.
Yeah.
That is a kind of Taliban-appointed ministry or agency that oversees the rolling out of these regulations, that determines these laws for the lives of civilians and in turn manages the enforcement of them.
Exactly. And so they announced these new laws. And I mean, these laws really covered a whole spectrum of activities and of parts of society. There were 35 articles included in this announcement. The mandates, as I said, were fairly broad. They ranged from things like banning music and photos of living beings. So people can't walk around with photos of their loved ones.
And this one has raised concerns about free press and media in Afghanistan. You know, if you can't broadcast the image of a person, what does that mean for any kind of news coverage?
Yeah, a missing person. You know, you can't post the missing person because they could hopefully be alive and they are not allowed to have their image published. So it could have, all sorts of ramifications. Some of the other things that were included in this was forbidding men and women who aren't related from looking at one another. And then aside from those, there were also several mandates that specifically restricted women outside of the home. And this is, I think, the part that most of the headlines have really been focusing on. For example, the Taliban has banned the sound of women's voices in public. That's prohibiting them from speaking. And it also has introduced the requirement that women's faces and bodies must be covered at all times in public. The explicit rule here is, I'm quoting, whenever an adult woman leaves her home out of necessity, she is obliged to conceal her face, her voice, and her body. Now, the Taliban spokesperson said that the laws are derived from Islamic sources.
I think if you look closely at the restrictions and the kind of way that the Taliban has rolled them out in stages over the last 3 years, what becomes clearer and clearer is this move towards completely restricting women's lives from outside of the home in an effort to kind of, I suppose, force women to stay home because the only real freedoms they can enjoy
are inside the home,
are within the confines of their home. So these are obviously really significant laws. And while there were restrictions previously on the lives of women in Afghanistan, you know, this has just ramped that up even further. What have we seen in terms of the response to this specific announcement? Have the international community said much?
Yeah, I mean, the UN has been very loud in their condemnation of these new laws. So we heard from the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. The head there, Rosa Otunbayeva, said banning the sound of a female voice outside the home was an extension of the already intolerable restrictions on women and girls in Afghanistan. She said that the Taliban could use severe enforcement mechanisms to ensure community compliance with its significant restrictions. And then she added, and I'll quote here, "The Afghan people deserve much better than being threatened or jailed if they happen to be late for prayers, glance at a member of the opposite sex who is not a family member, or possess a photo of a loved one." And there she is, of course, referring to the kind of full spectrum of those restrictions that have since come into place.
So a lot of criticism that has fallen quite squarely at the feet of the Taliban. Have we heard from the group themselves?
Yeah, so the Taliban has criticised specifically the UN for its comments against the regime. They've said that the concerns are, quote, unfounded. A Taliban spokesperson said that rejecting the laws without a thorough understanding of, quote, Islamic values was an expression of arrogance. He also stated that the restrictions would be enforced without violating any rights and that no individual will be subjected to injustice. He said these laws will be applied universally and equitably across our society.
So you have mentioned that the Taliban kind of defend these regulations as being rooted in Islamic teachings. And that is something that is sort of brought up time and time again by this regime as the kind of guiding light of the restrictions it imposes. But this is an extremist group and an extreme interpretation of Islam. And I might add, the Australian government itself continues to condemn the actions of the Taliban and says that it will continue to judge the Taliban regime by its actions. On that note, specific to this story, have we heard anything from the government in response to these new restrictions?
Yeah, we have. So Penny Wong, Australia's foreign minister, she issued a statement that said Australia condemns the Taliban's efforts to silence the voices of Afghanistan's women and girls. And she said that Australia stands together with those women and girls of Afghanistan and in support of their human rights. So a very clear statement there from the Australian government about how they have responded to this latest measure by the Taliban.
Zara, thank you so much for explaining all of that to us today. Obviously, we will stay on top of what happens from here in terms of the morality police and enforcement and, you know, how the citizens of Afghanistan will respond will remain to be seen. You know, maybe we will see a wave of protest action. We'll stay across it. And as always, we will keep you updated on the Daily Aus.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of those stories, you know, when Kabul fell and there were so many concerns about what the reality for women and girls would look like. You know, there was this real moment in time where I feel like a lot of the Western world really, you know, had their eyes firmly on Afghanistan. Like anything in the news cycle, I think that has diminished over time, and that stories like this are a reminder that just because the news cycle moves on doesn't mean that the reality for so many changes at all on the ground. And I think that, you know, 3 years on, it's an important story to cover, and it's an important story to keep talking about and to keep monitoring, as you said, over the coming months and years.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of The Daily Aus. Don't forget to follow us wherever you listen or subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching the podcast over there. We'll be back with another episode tomorrow, but until then, have a great day.